Savannah, Georgia, October 14, 2003. During renovations of a pre-Civil War mansion on Abercorn Street, once home to the long-abandoned Savannah Music Academy, contractors uncovered a sealed attic trunk beneath layers of dust and warped wood. Inside were 12 leather-bound journals, cracked ivory tuning forks, and a ledger marked Heinrich von Mueller, 1852. The journals belonged to the Academy's students, young women from Savannah's wealthiest families, 11 of whom were later institutionalized at the Chatham Asylum for the Feeble-Minded. Their entries spoke of lessons that became unbearable, tones that burrowed into the skull, and one sound so pure it makes you want to die. Von Mueller was recorded in city records as a celebrated instructor of European technique, refining the daughters of plantation owners and magistrates. After his sudden disappearance in 1855, he vanished from census rolls. The Academy closed soon after. Official files on his death were sealed, with a 1856 municipal report lost to the courthouse fire of 1887. Fragments of family correspondence suggest what officials found in the music hall's basement. "The sound," one father wrote, "was still ringing when we broke open the doors." What authorities uncovered next would haunt Savannah for generations. Before we continue with the story of Professor Heinrich von Mueller and his horrific experiments beneath the Savannah Music Academy, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Comment below what state you're listening from. And now let's return to the year 1852 when the music began. Savannah, in the middle of the 19th century, was a city balanced between beauty and decay. The cobblestone streets were shaded by live oaks whose limbs hung low with Spanish moss, and the air itself seemed heavy with perfume and salt. Ships moved through the harbor like silent shadows, bearing cotton, indigo, and rice. It was a city proud of its refinement, though that refinement rested on an unspoken foundation of bondage and labor drawn from the plantations that surrounded it. In those years, wealth expressed itself not only in fine houses or imported furniture, but in the cultivation of manners. The daughters of Savannah's upper class were trained to be decorative proof of their family's gentility. They were instructed in painting, languages, and most importantly, music. The pianoforte had become a mark of moral grace, a tool by which a young woman displayed her discipline and her breeding. It was into this world that a stranger arrived from Europe, a man whose name, in time, would be remembered only in whispers. Heinrich August von Mueller came to Savannah in the late summer of 1851, a man of middle years with the calm posture of one long accustomed to being observed. He was tall, thin, and impeccably precise in both dress and speech. The newspapers of the day introduced him as a master of the European conservatory tradition, recently of Vienna. To the citizens of Savannah, that word alone, Vienna, was enough to guarantee legitimacy. Within weeks, the daughters of judges, planters, and merchants were brought to the doors of the Savannah Music Academy to receive his instruction. The building he occupied was an austere three-story structure of brick and iron near Abercorn Street, its interiors varnished to a dull gleam. He took a room above the classrooms and rarely ventured beyond its walls, except to attend church on Sundays. Even then, he did not sing wise to the congregation but listened with closed eyes, as though measuring each note. The townspeople described him as serious, perhaps melancholy. Some believed he had lost a wife in Europe, others that he had fled the upheavals of the 1848 revolutions. He offered no correction to either rumor. Students who studied under him found his methods unusual. He spoke not of melody or grace, but of resonance. He told them that tone existed not only in the ear but in the body, and that every note carried a physical effect. Lessons often stretched into the night, the same passage repeated until a girl trembled with exhaustion. He demanded that they hold a note until they felt its vibration through their ribs. When they faltered, he would smile faintly and say only that they were not yet in harmony. Parents, hearing of his rigor, praised it. In a culture that prized discipline above curiosity, a demanding instructor was considered a blessing. The fainting spells and nervous fits that followed his lessons were attributed to the frailty of youth. Physicians called it hysteria, the fashionable diagnosis of the age, and advised rest or institutional care. No one questioned the source of the suffering. By the spring of 1852, Von Mueller had become a fixture of Savannah society. He was invited to dine with magistrates, consulted on the purchase of imported instruments, and mentioned favorably in the city's weekly gazette. His recitals filled the Academy's hall with ladies in silks and gentlemen in waistcoats, all eager to hear their daughters perform the latest works of Europe. The professor would sit beside the piano, head inclined, eyes half closed, as the young women played. When the final chord faded, he would bow with a solemnity that seemed almost devotional. After each recital, he insisted on private reviews. The audience departed, leaving the lamplight and the silence of the empty hall. Neighbors later recalled hearing single notes sustained for unnatural lengths of time, followed by sudden bursts of discord. Servants who cleaned the practice rooms in the mornings spoke of peculiar details. Metronomes shattered on the floor, smears of blood on handkerchiefs, faint scorch marks beneath the piano's soundboard as though the air itself had burned. The professor's private chamber lay beneath the floorboards, reached by a narrow stairway. Few ever entered it. Deliveries were made to the back entrance, wooden crates containing brass tubes, coils of copper wire, and instruments no one recognized. He claimed they were for acoustic calibration. In truth, the room had been transformed into something closer to a laboratory. The walls were lined with plaster to dampen sound. Concealed pipes connected the piano above to resonating cavities below. When a student struck certain keys, the tones amplified, feeding back through the floor in waves imperceptible to the casual listener, but capable of setting every nerve on edge. Von Mueller recorded his results meticulously. The notebooks discovered more than a century later describe young women reduced to tears after prolonged sessions, their hands trembling uncontrollably, their vision narrowing to a tunnel of light. He measured their pulse, their respiration, and the duration of their auditory endurance. Each girl became a numbered subject in a private experiment masked as art. He was mapping the mind's breaking point through sound. The social order of Savannah made such secrecy possible. The Academy's patrons were among the most powerful men in the state, planters, legislators, and judges. Their names opened every door and closed every inquiry. To suggest impropriety on the part of a European gentleman of culture was unthinkable. When the first students fell ill, the blame was placed on delicate constitutions and nervous sensibilities. The physicians of the day, steeped in the language of moral weakness, diagnosed hysteria and prescribed isolation. By the end of 1853, 3 of von Mueller's pupils had been quietly committed to the Chatham Asylum for the feeble-minded. Their families spoke of them no more. Meanwhile, the professor's reputation only grew. He lectured occasionally on what he called the science of harmonic influence, claiming that the body responded to musical vibration as surely as it did to touch or light. The few scholars who attended his talks found his ideas strange but elegantly expressed. They did not see that he was no longer theorizing, he was observing, experimenting, refining. Letters preserved from the era hint that he began to receive private visitors after midnight. Carriages were seen waiting outside the Academy long after the city had gone still. Some speculated that he offered special instruction to patrons. Others believed the meetings were of a more secret nature. In the surviving records, the same pattern repeats, the city admiring what it did not understand, unwilling to ask what it feared to know. Behind the Academy's locked doors, the air vibrated constantly. Students described the feeling of pressure in their skulls, as if invisible hands were pressing against their ears. They spoke of phantom melodies that continued long after they stopped playing, of dreams filled with relentless rhythms and whispers in perfect pitch. One servant later confessed that she could not bear to pass the hallway outside the practice room after dusk, because the silence there was never complete. It seemed always to be listening back. By the close of 1854, 11 students had shown symptoms of what the physicians still called hysteria. 2 had been removed from the Academy, 1 had vanished altogether, her family insisting she was abroad. In truth, her name disappeared from church registries and city directories alike. No record of her burial exists. The Academy's prestige began to dim, though no scandal was spoken aloud. Von Mueller continued to teach until early 1855 when, without explanation, he dismissed his staff, locked the doors, and departed Savannah. His name appears once more in the port's manifest, booked on a steamer bound for Charleston, and after that, nowhere. The building remained vacant for years. Rain leaked through the roof, plaster peeled, and ivy crept across the shutters. Those who passed by claimed they sometimes heard faint music, even when no one was inside. When workmen eventually entered to clear the property, they found the lower rooms flooded and the walls lined with strange metal fittings. The discovery was noted briefly in a local newspaper and forgotten. Yet among the families who had entrusted their daughters to the Academy, the story never quite died. Some kept diaries locked away, others preserved fragments of sheet music annotated in trembling hands. They were reminders of a man who had spoken of harmony but studied dissonance, who had turned the art of music into a mechanism of suffering. In the city that prized civility above truth, no one dared to question the cost of that refinement. Savannah moved forward into the decade of war and ruin, and the name Heinrich von Mueller was quietly folded into the silence that Southern history so often demands. By the spring of 1853, the Savannah Music Academy was both revered and quietly feared. The families who could afford its tuition treated it as a final polish for their daughters, yet those same families began to whisper about strange, nervous ailments that seemed to follow its pupils. Among the many servants, tradesmen, and apprentices who moved through the Academy's narrow lanes each day, few paid attention to the rhythms of its schedule. But one young man, a carpenter's apprentice named Thomas Albright, began to notice the difference between ordinary practice and whatever it was that occurred after the sun went down. Thomas was 17, the son of a dockworker who had been killed when a crate collapsed on the wharf. He had been taken in by his uncle, a craftsman employed to repair the Academy's stair rails and doors. In exchange for his work, Thomas was permitted to attend evening lectures on music theory, sitting in the back of the hall where the proper students never looked his way. He had no ear for music, but he found the strange mathematics of it captivating. He often remained behind after his uncle had left, cleaning brushes and tools. It was in those late hours that he began to hear what he later described in his notebook as a living hum, a vibration that made the glass panes shiver. In the records that survive, his name appears only in passing, listed among the labourers paid for maintenance in 1853 and again in 1854. His presence might have vanished from history entirely, were it not for the discovery of his personal journal, found in a crate of household papers auctioned decades later. Written in uneven hand and dated across several months, it describes his slow realization that the professor's methods were not merely unconventional but something else altogether. He wrote of the professor descending nightly into the cellar, carrying with him a small lamb's whip and an object that gleamed like a tuning fork. He noticed that the piano above the cellar floor was connected by a hollow shaft. When the professor played alone, the vibrations traveled downward into whatever chamber lay below. Thomas once knelt beside the floorboards and felt the wood tremble beneath his palms. He described the sensation as though the building itself were breathing. At first he dismissed the matter as eccentricity. Savannah was filled with European tutors who conducted peculiar experiments in the name of science or art, but one night, while sweeping the corridor outside the main hall, he heard a sound that froze him in place, a tone so pure and sharp that his vision dimmed. The air seemed to ripple around it. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, a muffled cry rose and was cut short. After that evening, Thomas began to investigate. He watched the arrivals of carriages late at night and saw young women ushered inside through the side door, veiled and silent. He began to notice the peculiar comings and goings of crates marked with foreign script. He followed the paper trail where he could, reading delivery slips left in the refuse bins. The professor was importing materials not normally associated with musical instruction, thin copper sheets, medical glass, even quantities of quicksilver. In June of that year, one of the students, believed to be the daughter of a local magistrate, collapsed during a recital. Witnesses later said her body convulsed for several minutes before she fell still, her eyes open but unresponsive. She was taken away in her family's carriage and never appeared in society again. The incident was officially described as an episode of nervous exhaustion. Von Mueller continued teaching the next day, unchanged. Thomas confided what he had seen to his uncle, who cautioned him to say nothing. In Savannah, accusations again. A man of standing could destroy more than a reputation. They could ruin entire families. Among the cluttered table, he found a ledger written in a neat, angular hand. Each page listed dates, initials, and notations that seemed to measure time and pulse alongside pitch and duration. The final columns contained brief remarks that chilled him. References to threshold, disruption, total quiet. He closed the book, replaced it where he found it, and fled the chamber. Over the next weeks, he grew increasingly anxious. He began to feel a constant ringing in his ears, a residue of the tones he had heard echoing through the walls. His sleep was troubled by fragments of sound, notes that seemed to vibrate through the bones rather than the air. He confided his fear to a local physician, who dismissed it as fatigue. Within days, his symptoms worsened. He reported dizziness, bleeding from the nose, and sudden paralysis of the hands. Von Mueller attended the funeral, standing apart from the mourners in immaculate black attire. He bowed his head with the solemnity expected of a man of learning, and afterwards spoke briefly with the family, expressing regret that such a promising young craftsman had succumbed to illness. No one questioned his presence. What Thomas had discovered might have vanished entirely, if not for a single surviving page torn from his notebook. It was found years later among his uncle's papers. The handwriting, unsteady and incomplete, referred to the Academy's basement as a place where sound becomes touch. He wrote that there was a pattern to the suffering of the students, that the professor seemed to know exactly how far each could endure before they broke. The rest of the page is illegible, the ink blurred as if by water. The weeks following Thomas's death brought renewed unease. Parents of the Academy's students began to notice the change in their daughters: quiet panic behind polite smiles, sudden aversion to music, persistent headaches. And one family withdrew their child and arranged for her to rest at home. She reportedly woke screaming in the night, insisting she could hear piano chords through the walls. Another was found sitting motionless at the instrument, pressing the same key again and again until her fingers bled. Savannah's physicians held meetings to discuss what they termed a wave of nervous disorders among the city's young women. Their conclusions were predictable: delicate temperaments, overstimulation, and the stresses of refinement. The Academy continued to operate. The girl survived but was rendered mute. Her family removed her from Savannah within the week. Von Mueller offered no explanation. He simply stated that the young woman had suffered from an inherited weakness. The newspapers published a polite notice about her illness and praised the professor's composure during the incident. After that night, the Academy's doors were often closed. Servants reported hearing heavy machinery being moved in the cellar, though no such equipment was ever seen delivered. The few remaining students continued their lessons, but none ever performed again in public. In the following year, the number of afflicted students doubled. A pattern began to form, visible only in retrospect. Each had been the subject of the professor's late-night reviews, each had exhibited the same symptoms, and each family had been persuaded that silence was preferable to scandal. When one father attempted to investigate privately, arranging to meet a lawyer and confront the professor, his carriage overturned on the road to Tybee. The death was ruled accidental. His correspondence vanished from the courthouse files. By the end of 1854, the Academy's reputation was fading. The great families of Savannah turned their attention elsewhere, yet within those shuttered rooms the experiments continued. Thus, the witness who might have saved them all was gone, and the professor's secret continued undisturbed. By 1854, what had begun as private obsession had evolved into a carefully managed system. The Savannah Music Academy was no longer merely a place of instruction. Its halls, chambers, and secret basements had become instruments themselves, conduits for precise auditory manipulation. Heinrich von Mueller operated not as a solitary predator, but as the central node of a wider network, one whose influence reached into every layer of the city's elite. Von Mueller's process was meticulous. Each student was catalogued, assigned a number, and observed with precision. He recorded the frequencies that produced fatigue, tremors, or fainting, noting whether certain chords elicited fear, despair, or apathy. Those deemed particularly sensitive were kept in a constant cycle of repetition and observation. The instruments he had imported were altered subtly, wires and brass conduits fitted to amplify selected tones while muffling others. He did not act alone. A physician named Dr. Jonathan Pegram oversaw the student's health, or what passed for it. The doctor documented physiological reactions to prolonged exposure, noting changes in pulse, perspiration, and tremor. While he presented himself as a consultant on female nervous disorders, Pegram's participation ensured that the Academy's experiments were treated as legitimate medical observation. Records indicate he administered herbal tonics, whose effects intensified the girl's susceptibility, though the exact compounds are lost to time. A lawyer, Samuel Whitcomb, provided legal counsel. He drafted contracts, tuition agreements, and disclaimers carefully worded to absolve the Academy of liability for illness or distress. Family names were protected, reputations maintained, and the veil of propriety preserved. His presence ensured that no complaint reached the city's courts. Complaints that were filed vanished or were quietly reclassified as private family matters. Even the Academy's staff became unwitting accomplices. Housekeepers, servants, and apprentices carried out the professor's instructions without understanding the consequences. They swept, polished, and delivered materials, often hearing strange sounds that they assumed were part of rigorous musical training. Some reported feeling faint or disoriented, but complaints were dismissed. The methods of control were not limited to sound. The professor's records reveal a systematic approach to psychological coercion. Students were isolated during late-night sessions, instructed to perform alone in the presence of instruments that emitted inaudible vibrations. These sessions could last hours. When one student resisted, she was sometimes restrained in the chair at the center of the chamber. Von Mueller monitored reactions closely, adjusting frequencies to elicit specific symptoms: nausea, vertigo, panic, even temporary paralysis. Individual cases were noted with clinical precision. Miss Eleanor Pomeroy began to exhibit signs of obsessive repetition, pressing the same keys over and over until her fingers bled. Miss Catherine Alston developed auditory hallucinations, claiming that the piano continued to play in her absence. Mary Ann Screven suffered complete sensory withdrawal during her private lessons. Each case was recorded in the ledger as part of a larger experiment, a study of thresholds and endurance. The professor's obsession extended to family dynamics as well. Some parents were asked to withdraw daughters for short periods and return them weeks later, unaware that the separation was part of the study of resilience and memory. Letters, carefully intercepted and destroyed, detailed minor illnesses, fainting spells, and the progression toward what contemporaries termed hysteria. Over time, the network expanded. Von Mueller maintained correspondence with a small circle of European colleagues, exchanging notes on auditory experimentation and physiological response. These documents, long thought destroyed, suggest that he considered Savannah a laboratory for methods far more advanced than were publicly acknowledged at the time. The pattern of cruelty repeated over the following years. Each new student was measured, monitored, and catalogued. Some were transferred to the Chatham Asylum for observation, their confinement described as therapeutic, while others were quietly returned home, altered in ways that family and community failed to recognize. One observer, decades later, would note that the girls seemed to age prematurely in nervous tension, their smiles often forced, their voices brittle. The methods themselves were layered. Sound was the primary instrument, but secondary mechanisms amplified its effect. Herbal concoctions, regulated light exposure, and strict isolation intensified the girls' responses. The basement chamber became a laboratory in which combinations of these factors were applied with meticulous precision. Von Mueller adjusted each session as a composer would a symphony, seeking patterns and thresholds in human vulnerability. The network's complicity extended beyond professional circles. Servants who attempted to question or evade the instructions found their positions threatened. Rumors of illness or fainting among staff were interpreted as minor ailments, easily explained or quietly ignored. Even apprentices who tried to warn outsiders faced disbelief. Savannah's social hierarchy prioritized reputation above truth. The professor's control persisted until 1855. By then, 11 students had shown serious symptoms of what was described by physicians as hysteria. Some were institutionalized, some were hidden in family homes under supervision. Their daily lives were regimented to prevent observation by anyone outside the immediate circle. Each girl's reaction to sound, each faint tremor or cry was recorded. The ledger entries from this period reveal a methodical obsession, an intention to map the human psyche through vibration. By autumn, patterns emerged that were unmistakable to any careful observer. Each student followed a predictable trajectory: initial sensitivity, escalation of symptoms, eventual incapacitation, and in some cases, confinement. Even among those who remained outwardly functional, the effects were enduring. They exhibited signs of chronic nervous disorders, insomnia, and acute sensitivity to noise, sometimes years later. Von Mueller himself remained untouched by scrutiny. Publicly, he continued to offer recitals and lessons, his reputation unblemished. He hosted the city's dignitaries, offering polite explanations for any irregularity. Internally, he managed his network of accomplices, adjusting methods, refining measurements, and ensuring that the system's operation remained hidden. Within this framework, the students were no longer individuals but subjects in a meticulous experiment. Every note played, every pulse measured, every fainting spell recorded contributed to a growing body of data, one that von Mueller manipulated to push his subjects to their psychological limits. By the conclusion of 1855, the full scope of the system had been established. 11 students were debilitated, 3 had been institutionalized, and the rest showed signs of permanent psychological alteration. The network of accomplices ensured that no complaint reached public authorities. Even those who suspected the truth were silenced by social pressure, threats, or illness. The system was complete, and its architect remained untouched, celebrated, and respected. By 1856, the delicate balance that Heinrich von Mueller had maintained for years began to show cracks. The Civil War loomed over Savannah, and the social structures that had protected him grew increasingly unstable. Families who had once defended his methods were distracted by broader threats to their wealth and estates. The city itself shifted, the streets becoming a place of urgency, rumor, and tension. The academy remained closed much of the time, its once polished floors dulled by neglect and a thin coating of dust, yet the professor continued his work in secret. It began with small, inexplicable accidents. One of the physician collaborators, Dr. Jonathan Pegram, fell ill after exposure to fumes from the experimental herbs he had administered. His symptoms, dizziness, nausea, and gradual loss of coordination, mirrored those he had once observed in the students. He recovered enough to continue, but the incident prompted whispered fears among the network. Von Mueller, ever calculating, appeared unconcerned. He adjusted his methods quietly, leaving no trace of responsibility. Meanwhile, the remaining students began to vanish under circumstances that were never fully recorded. Families reported sudden relocations or illnesses, but no official cause was established. One girl disappeared after being sent home for what her parents assumed was a nervous episode. Her absence was attributed to boarding with distant relatives, but she never surfaced in the city again. Another succumbed to what physicians documented as rapid decline, though the subtle injuries and effects of prolonged exposure to the chamber's vibrations were evident in notes later recovered. As these disappearances accumulated, outside attention grew. A journalist from Charleston, intrigued by the string of ailments affecting young women in Savannah, began investigating the academy. He interviewed former servants and local tradesmen who recalled nights of unearthly hums and children weeping alone in locked rooms. Attempts to access city archives revealed that key documents had been removed or misfiled. Prominent families assured him that all records were in order, but the cumulative weight of evidence hinted at something deeply unnatural. The first public challenge came in the form of a carriage accident. One of the magistrate's fathers, who had quietly sought to uncover the truth about his daughter's confinement, left his home to meet von Mueller privately. His carriage overturned along the road to Tybee Island. The accident was deemed unfortunate but routine, and no investigation was conducted. His correspondence and any testimony that might have exposed the professor's activities disappeared with him. Savannah's social order ensured that no inquiry reached public courts. By 1857, even von Mueller's closest accomplices were compromised. Samuel Whitcomb, the lawyer, faced criticism for mismanaging property matters unrelated to the academy, and Dr. Pegram's recurrent illnesses made his continued participation increasingly difficult. Without their support, the professor's ability to maintain secrecy was strained. Deliveries of specialized instruments slowed, and the basement chambers fell into partial disrepair. It was during this period of vulnerability that the system began to unravel. The student's condition, once controlled through precise manipulation, became unpredictable. Some developed permanent sensory withdrawal. Others exhibited intense physical reactions that could no longer be contained. One student, in a rare attempt at self-defense, damaged part of the instrumentation, disrupting months of careful calibration. Von Mueller's control, previously absolute, faltered. The outbreak of the Civil War accelerated the collapse. Savannah's port became military. Zed and the city's elite were drawn into the conflict. The academy, long shielded by social privilege, could no longer function as an isolated laboratory. Carriages were requisitioned for troop movements, servants conscripted or dispersed, and supplies of instruments and specialized materials became impossible to maintain. Amid the chaos, the professor disappeared from public view. Accounts vary. Some suggest he left Savannah under cover of night, boarding a steamer to an unknown port. Others hint that he died alone within the city, his body later discovered in a cistern, head tilted unnaturally against the stones. No record survives to confirm either story. The official city death registry lists only a man matching his description who died of unspecified causes in 1860, but no further detail is provided. Even in his absence, the consequences of his system persisted. Students remained incapacitated, some confined to institutions, others hidden in private homes. Families continued to protect reputations at the cost of truth. Physicians who had participated quietly revised their notes, attributing symptoms to inherited weakness or the stresses of refinement. The city itself seemed eager to erase any trace of the academy's operations. What remains of this period is fragmentary yet compelling. Diaries recovered decades later describe children writhing under invisible pressures, mothers who feared to intervene, and instruments that seemed to act with will. Architects' records note modifications to the basement that were unusual for a music school. Reinforced walls, concealed ducts, and mounting brackets capable of holding heavy resonating panels. All of these suggest a methodical approach to psychological and physiological experimentation. Survivors who reached adulthood told stories in hushed tones. They spoke of a sound that penetrated the skull, of chairs that constrained them, of long nights during which instruments replayed continuously until nerves gave way. Some reported a sense of being observed even when alone. Their testimonies, scattered and inconsistent in the historical record, are corroborated by the instruments and rooms discovered in the 21st century. By the late 1850s, Savannah had moved on. The academy was abandoned, its reputation quietly erased. Families removed their daughters from the city or placed them in distant care. The Civil War and its aftermath ensured that few remembered the finer details. Yet within the walls of the building and the memories of those who survived, the traces of von Mueller's system persisted. It is clear now that what authorities found in the aftermath would haunt Savannah for generations. Instruments designed for music had become tools of manipulation. A network of the city's professionals, whether willingly or through social pressure, had allowed the system to operate unchecked, and 11 students had endured suffering that no contemporary investigation could fully explain. The professor's disappearance and presumed death marked only the beginning of the academy's legacy. In the decades that followed, rumors of ghostly piano tones, of cries echoing through empty halls, and of young women driven to mysterious illness continued to circulate. The precise mechanisms of von Mueller's cruelty were obscured by time, social silence, and the destruction of official records. Yet even fragmentary accounts make it clear that his methods were neither accidental nor isolated. They were systematic, deliberate, and horrifyingly effective. The city, the families, and the surviving accomplices all shared in the maintenance of this secret. Von Mueller's downfall may have been inevitable, but the consequences of his system lingered, shaping the lives of the girls, their families, and the community. The Academy's rooms, its instruments, and the faint traces of its soundscape became relics of an experiment conducted with meticulous precision, a record of suffering hidden beneath the veneer of civility and culture. The passage of time did little to erase the traces of what had occurred at the Savannah Music Academy. By the turn of the 20th century, the building itself had fallen into neglect. The brick facade was weathered, windows broken or boarded over, and the iron railings along the staircases rusted through. Moss grew thick in the corners of the overgrown gardens, and the oak-lined avenues surrounding the property became shadowed corridors of memory rather than streets of social display. Generations had come and gone. The families who once entrusted their daughters to the Academy's instruction had dispersed. Some had moved north during Reconstruction. Others remained, their names still present in the city's official registers, but their personal histories marked by silence. Children of those students grew up hearing only vague warnings about delicate nerves, sensitivity, or episodes that were never fully explained. The Academy itself had become a cautionary tale whispered among servants or noted briefly in family letters, its details deliberately obfuscated. In 1920, an architect named Leonard Hargrove undertook a survey of Savannah's old properties in preparation for urban redevelopment. The Music Academy was scheduled for renovation to accommodate new offices, and Hargrove gained access to the attic and basement chambers for the first time in decades. There, beneath layers of dust, he discovered a cache of journals, ledgers, and loose papers, their bindings frayed and pages brittle. Many were written in German script, their content at first appearing to relate to musical instruction or architectural notation, but a careful examination revealed detailed records of experiments with sound, descriptions of young women's reactions, and lists of frequencies, durations, and physiological effects. The discovery was shocking, though Hargrove, mindful of propriety and the influence of the city's prominent families, reported only a fragment of his findings. In private correspondence with a historian friend in Charleston, he noted that the journals contained a pattern of deliberate study on the endurance of the human mind and body to controlled vibration, and he alluded to a chair fixed to the floorboards, described as a device of unusual and alarming construction. The letters were never published, and the papers themselves were quietly returned to storage, unexamined for decades more. In the 1930s and 1940s, a series of urban renovations uncovered additional evidence. In the basement, metal brackets and channels embedded in the plaster walls suggested the amplification of sound, likely aligned with the original experiments. Brickwork that had once been concealed behind wood paneling bore scratches consistent with long-term use or stress, and small fragments of instruments were found, corroded but unmistakable. Occasionally, workmen reported strange vibrations or hums when the air shifted through the narrow conduits. These occurrences were dismissed at the time as echoes, settling walls, or superstition. Alongside the physical artifacts were diaries and letters from the students themselves, many of which had been preserved in private estates or in boxes forgotten in attics. These documents described experiences in precise, unnerving detail: the sensation of sound pressing through the skull, the feeling of helplessness while restrained, the nightmares that followed hours of exposure to vibration, and the gradual onset of anxiety and sensory withdrawal. One diary spoke of a sound that seemed to move the bones and make one want to die, an auditory experience both acute and persistent. Another referenced the late-night sessions, the isolation, and the way the instructor would observe without expression, noting responses with meticulously. Even in the decades that followed, the families of Savannah were reluctant to acknowledge the Academy's history. Social pressure, shame, and the desire to protect lineage ensured that documents were hidden, journals locked away, and oral accounts curtailed. Yet the city itself retained echoes of the past. Residents living near the old property often reported faint, inexplicable hums or piano tones, particularly in the late evening when the wind passed through the empty streets. Stories circulated quietly of shadows glimpsed in abandoned windows, of children uneasy at the sight of the building, and of the faint odor of varnish lingering in the corners where no work had been done. By the 1950s, professional historians and archivists began to take notice. University researchers, combing through Chatham Asylum files and private collections, uncovered fragments that confirmed aspects of von Mueller's work. Admission logs indicated that 11 young women from the Academy had been institutionalized between 1853 and 1855. The notation of hysteria appeared repeatedly, accompanied by brief remarks regarding sensitivity to sound or music. Correspondence between physicians documented their belief that the symptoms were hereditary or constitutional, though subtle indications suggested a deeper environmental cause. Further corroboration came from oral traditions preserved among the descendants of former staff and servants. Elderly residents recounted stories told by grandparents, children confined to rooms, strange instruments placed near the floorboards, long nights of music and observation, and a man who never smiled but always watched. These accounts, often dismissed as folklore, matched remarkably with the surviving documents, reinforcing the historical reality of von Mueller's operations. By the late 20th century, the site underwent another renovation, this time more extensive, during which additional journals were found concealed in the attic. Among these were handwritten descriptions of the methods used to record each student's reactions to vibration, the progression of physical and mental symptoms, and the deliberate isolation that prevented them from seeking help. A few letters described parents' attempts to question the Academy, only to be reassured or dismissed. In some cases, these letters hinted at mysterious illnesses or accidents befalling those who inquired too closely, suggesting that von Mueller had actively safeguarded his methods through intimidation and circumstance. The rediscovered evidence painted a picture both horrifying and systematic. Von Mueller had not acted on whim or cruelty alone. He had created a network, designed a methodology, and meticulously recorded outcomes. The instruments, the architectural modifications, the accomplices in medicine and law, and the silence of families all contributed to a carefully controlled system of psychological and auditory torture. Even today, the physical traces remain partially visible. Floors show faint impressions where chairs were once anchored. Channels and ducts in walls hint at the hidden conduits for sound, and fragments of specialized instruments, corroded and fragile, survive in archival collections. The building itself, though repurposed or abandoned at various points, retains an air of unease, as though the vibrations of the past continue to resonate through its structure. Some of the students' descendants remain in the area, unaware of the full extent of the trauma their ancestors endured. Oral traditions and fragmented letters ensure that, while the city moves on, the memory of the Academy lingers beneath the surface. Scholars attempting to piece together the history must rely on indirect evidence, drawing conclusions from scattered diaries, architectural modifications, and corroborated anecdotes. Even the most thorough investigation cannot fully capture the precise experiences endured by the young women who passed through von Mueller's care. In conclusion, the story of the Savannah Music Academy and Heinrich von Mueller is not merely a tale of isolated cruelty. It is the record of a meticulously executed experiment, a system of control and observation that exploited social structures, trust, and the veneer of refinement. Rediscovered evidence, whether journals, architectural remnants, or oral histories, confirms that the horror was real and sustained. What authorities and families suppressed for decades may never be fully reconstructed, but the fragments that survive reveal a calculated, enduring human cruelty. Some secrets buried in Savannah may never be fully revealed, The music that once manipulated the minds of 11 young women, the instruments designed to induce fear and helplessness, and the meticulous records of suffering all remain hidden beneath layers of dust, silence, and the passing of generations. Yet through careful scholarship and the rediscovery of historical artifacts, the city's buried history can, at last, be acknowledged, studied, and remembered. The echoes of sound that moved through the building, the tremors that coursed through the bodies of its students, and the meticulous attention to every response remain a haunting testament to what human ingenuity can achieve when guided by obsession and concealed by social authority. Even now, the legacy of the Academy endures in the city's memory, in the surviving artifacts, and in the cautionary lessons of history itself.